We turn now to the book of Acts, where we will be reading from the 9th chapter, the first 20 verses. As I read these words, I invite you to listen for a good word from the Lord. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias?" And he answered, "Here I am, Lord." The Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay hands on him, so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. For several days he was with the disciples in Damascus, and he immediately began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It would seem, at least in my estimation, that humility is a crucial aspect of the Christian faith. The Christian faith requires us to be humble. After all, it was the Apostle Paul himself who described in the letter to the Philippians, the 2nd chapter, that Jesus himself, the one around whom we center our lives and our faith, he humbled himself. He emptied himself of everything. Even though he was God, he came to be like us. He came to be born in human likeness, taking on flesh, becoming a servant. He humbled himself even to the point of death, it says, even death on a cross. And so, in my estimation at least, there is no room for grandiosity or arrogance in the life of faith. We live a humble faith, in fact. And humility could take many different forms, but at least as I read it in relation to this passage that we have from the book of Acts today, humility at least means having confidence in your faith, but also recognizing your humanity enough to recognize when you get it wrong. It means having confidence in your faith, but knowing that you still have so much to learn and so much growing that you need to do. Now, I would say that not many of us here have been in the place where Saul was, at least not, I would hope, breathing murderous threats against other people. But certainly many of us have been quite certain in our way of understanding things. We've felt like we've had every answer at some point. We have been headstrong and moving in one path only to come at some point to a recognition where we're going the wrong way. Some of us have chosen our careers over other relationships, and we've suffered those relationships as a case of it. Some of us can't forgive the hurt that we feel, even though we know it's what we're called to do. We know that Christ calls us to love others, especially those who are in covenant with us in our family of faith, and yet sometimes expressing that love is not as easy as it should be for us. Some of us tend to spend our energy seeking to please others, not recognizing necessarily the destruction that that person is bringing on us as we seek their approval. Some of us choose revenge instead of reconciliation because the revenge, at least the idea of it, gives us some sense of control. And many of us are just so sure in what we know to be true that compromise becomes a bad word to the point where we refuse to learn anything new. It would seem today that part of the human experience is to be on the wrong path sometimes. It's just part of being human. Even in the beginning, we are told that the humans tried to go their own way only to realize that that was wrong. We get stopped in our tracks. In the most compelling moments when those happened, God is clearly involved. We have a word for this in our faith. It's called metanoia. Conversion, repentance, turning around, going in a different way, walking a new road. The Apostle Paul, once named Saul, as we find out in the book of Acts here today, he had a moment like this. It was so important, so central to his life, so central to his story, that it's told 3 different times in the book of Acts. The writer of Acts, Luke, who also wrote the gospel, thinks it's so important that he tells it twice as the narrator. Luke's just telling it to remind us of Paul's story. But even beyond that, he has to tell it himself. Paul has to tell it in his own words. And he talks about it time and again in his different letters to the different churches, reminding them of the life he used to live in accordance with the law versus the life that he lived out of the grace of Jesus Christ. The first time we meet Saul, it's almost as an incidental character. The disciple, a follower of Jesus named Stephen, who's brought before the high council to give testimony to what has been going on in the life of these believers, these Christ followers. He starts recounting for all of these leaders the history of the world, basically, as it's told to the people of Israel, and everything seems to be going fine until he accuses them of murdering God's righteous one. They see his words as blasphemy. It's so bad, in fact, it brings up so much anger within them that they sentence him to death. They drag him outside to stone him, and as they pick up their stones, they take off their coats. And Luke simply says they lay them at the feet of a man named Saul, who approved of everything that they were doing. Saul knows 2 things at this point in his life. That this way of Jesus, this faith in Jesus is spreading. And in his mind, it has to be stopped. This way must be wiped out in order for the will of God to be continued to be made manifest in the world. How ironic it is that God would use him to become the greatest proclaimer of the faith. With letters in hand, he travels the road to Damascus. And that's where Jesus at last gets a hold of him and puts him on a new road, a new straight path. There's a bright light and a voice speaking directly to him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you, Lord? The answer he receives is one he never would have expected. It's the voice of Jesus. The one whose movement he is trying to squash is the one who grabs hold of him and blinds him and speaks directly to him and says, I've got another way that you need to go. Saul is so determined to do what he sees in his mind as something that is good that he, even before Jesus blinds him, is blinded by his own arrogance to the destruction that his purity movement is bringing upon God's world. He sees what's happening in Jesus and he misreads it completely. So he's not only taken surprise by the light and the voice, but he's taken surprise by the one who's speaking to him. Could it be Jesus, the one who he's trying to destroy? Might he actually be the one who is bringing God's will to bear upon the world? Now, there are certainly many lessons that we have to take from this passage. We study it time and time again. The story is familiar to us. The idea of turning and going a different way, the idea of a Damascus Road experience is so ubiquitous in our culture that you simply say the word and people know the type of change you're talking about. But at the very least, I read this: persecution in God's name is never okay. There are those on the extremes of any issue and any religious tradition who would want to purge anyone who does not think exactly as they do, does not believe exactly as they do. There are those who would limit the rights of those who don't fit in. They'd refuse them services and treatment of any kind, and they do it under the guise of their religious freedom. But I go back to Matthew 25. Where Jesus himself looked at his disciples and you said, you want to know if you're following me? There's going to come a time when you'll be asked, did you serve those who were the last and the lost and the least, anyone who was in need? And if you did, you did it to me. And if you didn't, you refused it of me. As I read that gospel passage along the persecution that we're told of Saul today, it's my humble reading that says to persecute anyone in the name of God is to persecute Jesus himself. Thomas Merton once said that our job is to love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they are worthy. That is not our business. And in fact, it's nobody's business. What we are asked to do, he says, is to love. And this love itself will render both ourselves and our neighbors worthy. So Saul is told to sit. Take a divine time out. God even blinds him from seeing anything else around him so that he can just be with his thoughts in prayer, considering all that he has done to this point with the weight of it upon him. And finally, Ananias comes to explain exactly what's going on. Even Ananias himself, he's hesitant. He knows the reputation that Saul has. He recognizes that if he goes, if he follows God, if he follows the words of Jesus, if he goes to Saul and he's misheard something, he's putting his life on the line. And yet he goes anyway. He goes, he lays hands on him, almost in a way of ordination. He prays for him. He baptizes him. He gives him food. And most of all, without anything else, because Jesus told him to, he calls him brother. Saul becomes immediately incorporated into the life of this church. This church, as he's persecuted, welcomes him with open arms because they can recognize the change in him. And the only way it could have happened is because the Spirit of Christ has been at work in him. And he starts to preach like nobody has preached before, going where nobody was willing to go before. If Jesus told the disciples that they were going to bear witness in word and deed to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, Paul says, I'm going, are you coming with me? Only Christ could bring this kind of reversal in Saul's life. The persecutor learns that he must suffer just as Christ did. But he brought in to the community and loved and accepted and welcomed as a brother. I told you a couple of weeks ago about a man named Denver Moore. He became a homeless advocate because he was once homeless himself. He found himself in Fort Worth, Texas at one point. He had been there, I believe, in jail. At one point, he had been a Louisiana sharecropper. He had found that it was not working for him. He was desperate, and so he committed armed robbery, was convicted and thrown in jail, and when he got out, he had very little option. He found himself at a ministry center where he ran into a man named Ron Hall and his wife named Deborah. Now, Ron and Deborah wanted to use their time and their resources to support those who were homeless in their neighborhood and in their city. And it started out as this relationship of haves giving to someone who has not. But that's not where it ended. The two, Ron and Denver, became fast friends. They began to live and pray and love with one another. They began to serve one another in the ways that they needed. And when Ron's wife, Deborah, got cancer and eventually died, it was Denver who was by her side and was her greatest prayer warrior. As those who have known this story have described it, both men needed each other. They had gifts that God had placed within them that they needed. And only by the grace of God could they be brought together in this way. Theologian Charles Campbell says that the living Christ is loose in the world, encountering people and shaping the community of faith, often in surprising ways for our mission in the world. In the presence of the living Christ, persecutors become allies who share the suffering of the persecuted. Ordinary believers provide the gift of discernment. Enemies become brothers and sisters. Violence is replaced by witness. Ordination, baptism, and the Eucharist become vehicles for the transforming and empowering work of the Spirit. And the Word is lived and proclaimed in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Our challenge in reading this passage today is the recognition that we have to keep our eyes open and look at all of those who are in our life and ask whether or not they've been put in our life for a reason, or perhaps we have been put in theirs, or God has brought us together so that we can be community for one another in the ways that we need, particularly in times of chaos and tragedy when the world simply doesn't make sense. Those of you who are a part of the life of this church know my story. You know that my father is a pastor. He's in the Atlanta area, in the suburban area. He is currently serving in a church that he's been in for 15, 16, long time, a lot of years. He's also the part of an interfaith clergy group. Within his group, there are Baptist pastors like him. There are other mainline Protestant pastors. There are some priests of both the Catholic and the Episcopal Church. And yes, there are also Jewish rabbis and Muslim imams. And what they have realized is though their traditions taught them to question and to fear one another, they have far more in common than they ever realized. They recognize that they love God in their own way and that they want to bring about God's will in the way that they interpret it. They recognize that they love the congregations they serve with their whole hearts. They recognize that they're having challenges with younger generations that are emerging that no longer want to hold to the traditions that their religion has tried to pass down to them. They found community with one another in ways that few people are able. This was important because I called my father on March 15th of this year. It was a Friday. I can't remember for the reason for the call, but I asked him at some point in the conversation, what are you going to be doing later on today? Just asking what his plans were and what his plans with Mom might be throughout the weekend. He said, well, I'm actually going to be going to the Himza Islamic Center a little bit later on this afternoon. They're going to be holding a prayer service, and our interfaith clergy group is going to go and be there with them. If you think back to your mind, you might remember that March 15th was the day that terrorist attacks in New Zealand came upon mosques. People trying to rid the world of people that they don't understand. And so as that community there, who weren't directly affected, but who understood the impact of it on their life, gathered together in prayer as they do, a group of other clergy from other denominations, traditions, religions stood in the back, bearing witness to the fact that God had been the one that they thought had brought them together. And they recognized what they were going through. Churches shot up, blown up, and burned. Synagogues shot up, blown up, and burned. Mosques shot up, blown up, and burned. And here they were to say, those forces that would try to bring that upon you do not come from us or from God. And here we are, standing together as brothers. The world lost an important voice yesterday. Some of you may know her name, some of you may not. Her name is Rachel Held Evans. If you don't know her name or her writings, I would encourage you to go check them out. She was an important voice. She was 37 years old. She got taken from us far too soon to an illness that most of us don't understand as of yet. Seemed to be brought on in unexpected ways. But she was an important voice for many in my generation, particularly the women among us, that she spoke to their faith very clearly, recognizing the need for an evolving faith that continues to recognize the movement of a living God in Jesus Christ. She once says that it's a frightful thing thinking you have to get God right in order to get God to love you, thinking you're always one error away from damnation. It's a kind of legalism, really, and how ironic. The very condition of humanity is to be wrong about God. The moment we figure God out, God ceases to be God. And maybe it's time to embrace the mystery and let ourselves off the hook. She also said, the gospel doesn't need a coalition of the devoted to keep the wrong people out. It needs a family of sinners saved by grace, committed to tearing down the walls, throwing open the doors, and shouting, welcome. There's bread and wine. Come and eat with us and talk. This isn't a kingdom of the worthy. It's a kingdom for the hungry. Humility is a crucial part of the Christian life. We can be so staunch in our beliefs that we might not be able to see the ways that we are walking the road might just be wrong. And we might just have to admit that there's still so much that we need to learn, because there's still so much that God is doing in the world. And mostly we need to learn from each other and those around us. Someone once said that the most revolutionary thing you can do is introduce people to each other. It's a truly powerful thing. Just ask Paul and Ananias. Amen.